So as we go through this class, I want you all to be thinking about those components, right? The different types of infrastructure, systems, and environments that design is either influenced by or influences. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into this video so we can hear from our guest speaker.
This is a very simple formula. So let's get started. This is the formula. This is a very simple formula. So let's get started. This is the formula for success. So it's people, process, and product. How does this relate? For a business, it is a group of people coming together. So this is your business. The group of people working together using a specific process that then produces a product. Now this could be in terms of a services or a physical product, and that works too. So why is this important? If you have the right product, in other words, the product that solves a problem for an end user. If this product solves a problem, then in return, the end user is happy, which then returns money to the business. If there is no people, there is no product, because without people, you can't produce a product. So people is critical. This means hiring is critical. In order to find the right people, you must be able to attract these people to your company. And how do you do that? By providing the right environment. By providing the right pay. This then attracts the right people. Now, what does right people mean? The right people is the ones that help the business produce a product that solves the problem for the end user. If you don't have the right people, they then does not produce the right product. In return, does not solve the problem. Therefore, this end user is unhappy and they will go somewhere else to find product. In order to keep this circle going, you must have the right people. If you have a person that you hire and they are not looking to solve the problem, all they want is to say, hey, I just want money coming in. Short-term view on the product, for example, I don't care about the end results. as long as it solves the problem while I'm here, and it lasts while they are there, they just want a short-term view, get the money while they're there, and they're good. But what happens is that on the long run, you get a lot of this. They then go away, you get less and less money. Business fail. In order to be successful, you must have the right person. Because these people here have options. Over time, they'll be more competitive. In order to compete, you must have good product. In order to have good product, you must have the right people that has the mindset of ensuring the product will continuously compete with the options. They must compete. How do you compete? They have to stay current in technology. They have to be constantly more innovative than the other options so that this cycle continues. If these people are short-minded, short-sighted, they only look after certain things, what happens is that you lose them, which in turn you lose money. So people are critical. If you have the people and you don't have the right process, it doesn't work. The process must be simple enough and effective and does not increase waste. Because waste means it costs more to build, therefore you're not competitive, which leads to clients running away because they have other options. So staying competitive, reducing waste, making sure you don't have a lot of waste here, being effective, being simple process allows us to build a product. But building a product isn't just any product. It must solve the problem. So solving the right problem makes your end user happy, which pays you money, which helps you increase your business. So the people that has the wrong mindset, that are only looking for short-term gains, will create and cause quality. They will cause quality issues with the product. They will cause product, or they will build product that is not maintainable. This means over the long run, your users are not happy because of a bad product. It is quality issues, bad product, right? It then goes away. they have other options, and you lose money. If the product is not maintainable, it means that in the long run, you're not able to be competitive. And possibly causes the people that built this to do more work, which then create waste, which in return creates bad quality product, and the cycle continues. So this cycle will continuously drive this. So you don't want this. Why would anybody want to do this? So key again is people. People working together with specific process will produce a product. The right people, the right process creates the right product, which makes people happy, which then means money for the business. So the formula is really simple, is ensuring you have the right people, right process, and making sure you're creating the right product, which will then make this person really happy and gives you money. If you like this video, click like and subscribe.
People, process, product. People, process, product. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Monique Alavarado is an emerging organizational development professional working in the nonprofit and communication sector, advocating for social justice causes. Monique fights for the very community she comes from, and she is honored to have a career using her lived experience to advocate for representation and alignment with her core values. Working in diverse work environments has provided Monique with valuable insights in developing engagement approaches, collaborating with interdisciplinary teams, and building deep motivation. Monique currently serves as the Organizational Development Project Manager at the Los Angeles Mission. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to you to Monique. Thank you so much again for being here.
Hi, everybody. So, and Renelle, if we can, is there an element of dialogue allowed in this?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So my name is Monique Alavarado, and as he gave a mouthful of my title and things I do, I work at a homeless shelter in the center of Skid Row. So just by like a show of icons or just your hands, can you guys let me know, how much do you know about homelessness and the importance of Skid Row to homelessness in the city of Los Angeles? I'm not able to see reactions, but okay. So homelessness, okay, thank you. Yeah, putting in the chat is a little easier. All right. Perfectly okay answers. It is okay. You can be as honest. It does not make or mean anything about your life. But all right. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
everyone
looks like there's a few
participating.
responses in the chat, not much. Some a little bit not sure, some a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and I think one, and especially coming from a design thinking perspective, I think the first place when you take the concepts that you're learning, okay, I'm just gonna give it like 2 more minutes actually before I go in. I'm just gonna give it like 1 more minute just to get everyone get in their last minute responses. Just be as honest as you can. Don't worry about it. Okay, perfect. So before we talk about homelessness and the work of the LA Mission, one of the things that got brought up is people and process. And oftentimes when you're dealing with architecture, when you're dealing with design, most often than not, if you're not in the social services sector or you're not in the homeless services sector, chances are, outside of the fact that you may have lived experience yourself, you may not actually know that much about homelessness. So a couple of statistics. So Los Angeles County currently has 69,144 people experiencing homelessness throughout LA. Did anyone know that the figure was that big? Okay. So from there, there is a lot of different there's a lot of differing perspectives on the causes of homelessness, but one of the most contentious issues that we see are people really wanting to know, where is the transitional housing? How do we get people housed? Now, the biggest cause of homelessness here in LA County is actually lack of affordable housing. If you were to look at the optics in the news, people would think it was substance abuse. People think it's mental illness, though those actually only make up to 29% of the population. And oftentimes those conditions are exacerbated primarily because the person is unhoused. I'll give you an example. If someone has diabetes and they need to eat healthy food, but they don't have a stove to cook healthy food, then chances are over time, that person's basic and or treatable health issue may be exacerbated over time. Or let's say if you are a family of 5 people, but there's only a housing placement for 3, chances are you may be outside of housing for a while. So, I mean, every person who's experiencing homelessness has various challenges and or issues as to why. Now, there's another part of homelessness that gets less talked about, and there's a population that people have often used the term service resistant. Now, if we're looking at the stereotypical view of someone experiencing homelessness in LA, and if you're looking at the media depiction, you're probably, noticing things like encampments. City of Los Angeles actually passed Ordinance 4118, which actually prohibited encampments within sensitive areas, and has, by what some homeless advocates believe, has effectively outlawed homelessness and criminalized it. So if people don't have housing and people don't have a place to live, the question is, how do they live? And if there's not enough beds for them, so it creates a very complex and contentious issue. Right now, if you're looking at the Los Angeles mayoral race, you see 2 different candidates who have differing perspectives on housing. Some people may feel that it's more important to lower the cost of affordable housing. As of right now, affordable housing in LA County are anywhere up to 886,000 per unit. Whereas you have some people who are looking at things like shipping containers, people looking at things like tiny homes, and even more so now because of the exacerbation of the crisis, it's reached a level where people just are so exactly, accessory dwelling unit. Thank you. There's actually, people are so kind of fed up or so at a limit of what can be done within the current regulations and housing stock, that we are definitely seeing a loosening of regulations. Had you gone to the city of LA, 10 years ago and you said, hey, let's do tiny homes, you would have gotten laughed at. Whereas now are recognizing the need to either free up funds, loosen up restrictions, and, you know, no matter where you go, everyone has a different perspective. But Project Room Key, yes, and that's actually a project that I worked on. Now, what happens when a person gets housed? So the thing is that we often think of housing and homelessness. It seems very obvious that the answer to homelessness is to give a home. Um, and I definitely want to encourage people, put open discussion, and I'll address it as we go along. So basically, we're now at a point where people are having to learn how to live in what your professor would call contested space. So we have people living in encampments. We have people who, because of the cleaning ordinances, are at stake to lose their items on any given day that a sanitation crew goes. Some homeless advocates feel that it is a very cruel thing to throw away a whole person's life for the purpose of public safety. But you could look on the other side of the argument and people saying, well, I don't want to see what they feel is people doing drugs, increasing violence, fire hazards that can happen from encampments not necessarily being habitable spaces. Now, you can look at this from the perspective of what you see in other countries. And I really do encourage people who are looking at the design of contested spaces to look at the role of space in contested countries, in contested spaces. We can look at examples such as going to Brazil. And Brazil is famous for the favelas, which again are kind of structured shanty towns that have developed. But amongst those shanty towns, you would actually be surprised at the amount of people who actually fight to keep them versus to get rid of them. Now, going into Skid Row a little bit, I want to talk to you a little bit about the LA mission, who's leading us and where we're at now. So the Los Angeles mission as an organization has been in providing services for about 86 years. I had it reversed. So for about 86 years, the Los Angeles mission has been in 3 locations. We were first out, came out of Biola University, actually. It started as a ministries, and a lot of rescue missions actually started as like kind of like a basement or a space where people were just finding food. You were giving a hot meal, maybe a place to shelter from the cold, maybe an emergency bed. But if you're thinking about the 1930s to the 50s, for that time period, because of the history of Skid Row was actually one of the manufacturing and transportation centers in the city. So Skid Row is actually right next to, obviously the historical warehouse districts and industry districts, and next to the historic core. So if you imagine in the 1930s, the profile of a person living in Skid Row was oftentimes a single working male. Males without families, alcoholics, that was something that you found as well as people lost their jobs. But overwhelmingly, it was going to be a single male, usually under the age of 60, who was within working age. And so that led to the building of what are called SRO hotels, which you may know as a bachelor apartment, but we would call that single room occupancy. So historically, Skid Row was the most affordable housing in LA, and it often was geared towards single room occupancy. So this rendering is our current shelter now, and we moved to our current location in 1992. That was a very specific and special year for a number of reasons. So important, and I will pass a paper to your professor after so you can read it. But the city of Los Angeles practiced what was called a policy of containment, meaning that as homelessness grew, people did not want to see what they felt were vagrants, hobos, all pejorative terms for people experiencing homelessness, in their financial districts. So what they did was they came up with an idea that if you put all the services, all the service providers, all the shelters in one area, it was going to, drive people to that area. So effectively legislating a slum in some people's perspective. Also, it would centralize services so that people may have easier access. So that was the idea. So the policy of containment did a couple of things. One, it effectively created what is now the current Skid Row as we see it. It also made service providers, so a Los Angeles Mission was one of those service providers who had moved from a few blocks up the road to into the core of Skid Row. And so this is the rendering of our current building. So one thing to keep in mind is that I want to go back to what I was saying about the population of Skid Row. And oftentimes when you're designing around homelessness, you have to consider who you're designing for. Homelessness is not one person and it is not a monolith. Actually, can you go back to the rendering a little bit? Can you go back up? Okay. So yeah, go back up to the model. Okay. So in this current model, you would actually notice, you wouldn't notice, but we actually had, you see, this is actually a rendering here that says women's shelter. And back in the 90s, when we were in a phase development, what is now the women's shelter, which is to the left, this smaller building that you're seeing to your left here. Ann Douglas, who, if anyone who knows who Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones is, so his mother, Ann Douglas, basically came for a tour of Skid Row, and she's like, "Where's the women's shelter?" And that's because at the time, up until the 1980s, and what we would see is a crack epidemic and the drug wars that you saw all over the place, the profile of somebody who was experiencing homelessness in Skid Row was overwhelmingly single male. Into the 80s and going into the early 90s, you're now starting to see more elderly, more women, more children and families. And so there was not a lot of housing and or resources to meet that need. So Ann Douglas, through a generous contribution, contributed the seed money for us to build that building. So that was actually supposed to be a parking lot. Now it is a women's shelter that provides about 50 beds. That is important though, because we were the first women's shelter in Skid Row, and even you continue to still see that there's really not a lot of housing that is geared towards single women and or families within Skid Row, which kind of reflects the historical makeup of the neighborhood. Now you can scroll down. I just want to take a quick pause. Any questions, comments, Ronell?
No, not at this time, but I guess one of the things that we talk about are the policy components. And so you mentioned containment, and then you also mentioned another component. I know that Skid Row zoned for us, like has a particular zoning. So just identifying some of the policy relationships that you talked about, I think is critical, because that policy constraint component impacts what can happen on site, or, you know, makes different considerations, you know, makes different possibilities of eligible on site, right? So
Right.
just really those policy constraints or considerations that are peculiar to Skid Row that they, as like landscape architect students thinking about an intervention, may want to consider.
Right. And so that is really key. And I think to offline that, I will definitely send you that paper. I can actually probably pull, if you give me a moment, I will put the link in. But part of, so actually, yeah, here's the, I'm going to drop a link into the chat. You guys can save and review, and you can consider this how a community chose to plan some of their interventions. This is what they would like to see. But the LA Poverty Department is an arts organization. And so going back to contested space, this space is a lot of things to different people. Now downtown LA is going through a lot of big development. So right now they're working on what's called the 2040 plan. And it's really a guiding community-based document that gives guidance to both business improvement districts, developers and stuff on how they're going to zone, how they're going to portion, how they're going to do things in Skid Row and other areas of the city. So the link that I just posted in the chat that you should bookmark and save reflects what would be the grassroots perspective and or what you would say the most common unhoused perspectives of what they would like to see included in the community plan.
Yeah.
What happened?
Hermilo, your mic is on.
We good?
Yeah, my question is, um, who is building this? I mean, my understanding is that the city builds those buildings to allow homeless to stay. Is the city who pays everything, or
No, absolutely. Thank you. And that's a great question. That is
Okay.
actually false. So actually the city has control of where we can build things and how we build things, but it's still very much private ownership, and private ownership can be, ownership can be held by a nonprofit organization, or it can be held by a corporation. And so in Skid Row, you're going to see a couple of things. You're going to see a mix of nonprofits like us, who may also have what is called a community development arm. So certainly around the 90s, you saw a lot of nonprofit organizations. A great example would be Skid Row Housing Trust, who they bought up a bunch of buildings from private owners, so that those would be held by the space would be held by the nonprofit. Now, what the city and state may do, city, state, federal government may fund the provision of services to those shelters, and or may provide provisionary funding depending on the type of funding. So the government is one type of funder, but for instance, the Los Angeles Mission, for the majority of our history, we've actually been about 90 to 95% privately funded. So the building that we own is ours. As a faith-based organization, we, in order to maintain certain tenets of our programming, have made an informed choice to, though we will accept government funding in outreach services in terms of like our beds and stuff, it gives us a little bit more control over how we can have that space. And that's for many reasons. One, just differing philosophies on how to run a program. And you see this all across the country. It also means that, like, as a faith-based organization, we're actually restricted from receiving certain types of funding exactly because we do have a faith-based component to some of our programs. So federal and or any governmental funds could only be accepted for program segments and or buildings that can be open to all according to the standards of the RFP or the grant, which can vary from place to place and entity by entity. There's certainly governmental funding that is inclusive of faith-based organizations and things like that, but you should understand that in most public housing, you're going to actually see a mix of funding sources. It may be a mix of government, so this may be like bond HHH. You may see a mix of capital, like investors who are seeing that, it's better to have an affordable housing complex where you can always get, a governmental contract. There's always going to be a need for that versus dealing with private markets. So it's a lot of different points of view. So one of the things, so I want to talk to you a little, now I want to take you a little bit into so we've kind of talked a bit about Skid Row. We've talked about the large environment. I kind of want to bring you into the mission and understand where we are now, what is changing and why. So as I said, our current building that you saw the rendering for the model for dates to 1992. So the organization had not had a significant remodel since then, I'm sure, outside of, necessary services or added wings. And so our new CEO, Troy F. Vaughn, is actually a person with lived experience of homelessness. He has been at the Los Angeles Mission. He actually was on the streets of Skid Row for about 7 years. He was a former veteran. And also he actually came out of homelessness through coming through a program like the LA Mission. So here you have a person who has now done a lot I mean, by external terms, a lot better in their life. They certainly turned around. He went from a resident to a president. And now he's the first Black person and Black person of lived experience in the 86-year history of our organization. So one of the first things that he decided to do, one of the first initiatives, the first thing that hit the ground running under his leadership was, we're remodeling the mission. And he called the name of this initiative is called Dignity by Design. So I'm gonna, if I can share my screen right now, I'm gonna walk you through a quick presentation, and I'm gonna show you the remodel of a dorm. Is everyone up for that? I'm gonna hear resounding yeses. Okay. Let me share my screen. Renelle, can you enable screen sharing?
You are now co-host, if that will allow you to share.
Okay. Okay, hold on, I'm just. Hold up, I'm just sorry, it's putting me through. Hold on. Apple just needs to make sure I'm not doing funny business. Okay, Renelle, can I give you a link to play?
Yeah, you can put it in the chat or email it to me, whichever one is easiest.
Okay, I'll put this here. Can you play this video? Sorry, I want to be mindful of the time boundary. All right, it would be the video in that news story.
It was demo day at the Los Angeles Mission in Skid Row. Reverend Troy Vaughn took the first whack at it.
Y'all ready? So what you see here is about the transformation of this third floor dorm. And this dorm is going to have individual units attached to it. And about 200 men will be able to be housed on this particular dorm.
This floor at the LA Mission served as an emergency homeless shelter and is now being remodeled.
We're looking for people to stay anywhere from 6 months to a year. We believe that the work that we do here is so transformative that we're able to move people into a permanent housing solution within 6 months.
The LA Mission invited board members and donors to help knock down the old space and way for the new sleeping units.
We wanted to give a sense of privacy to the guests so that they can actually sleep themselves, get a sense of privacy while they're staying at the shelter.
Let me walk you through one of these units. So they each cost about $3,000 to make. You have a twin bed right here, and then you also have a ton of storage. There's storage up here above the bed. There are some shelves down below. And then there's some storage underneath the bed. So you can see it filled right out. Then there is a folding desk. You can see back here there are some outlets to charge all of your devices. And there is a stool that goes with the desk. There's some storage underneath it, and it conveniently fits right back in here. To finish it off, there is a reading light for when it gets dark.
I'm so excited that we get to see the possibility of really meaningful change happening here in Skid Row.
Reverend Vaughn says this new emergency shelter floor should be ready for guests by August 30th. In Skid Row, Sophie Flay, ABC7 Eyewitness News.
All right. And then Renelle, I just sent you the rendering, so I want you guys to be able to see what the vision is. And then we'll open up for questions, okay?
Deal on top of all that. A win-win, as they say. That's money.
We make it easy.
Renell?
Okay, I am going to get that up.
A 16-year-old girl is
Give
in
me 1
serious
second.
condition.
Let me
No worries. You might
by
want to mute it.
5 large dogs.
press that. I'm gonna escape. And then that's in the email, correct?
Yes,
All right, let's pull that up.
and then you guys can reference it afterward. So while he's doing that, to bring you up to present, so we just finished the remodel of 1 floor, but for those of you who may know or may not know what dignity by design means, it's basically building human rights that opens rather closes space within the built environment for all people, regardless of where they're from. So the idea is to create a space that's a restorative space. So one, shelter, if you actually look at the perspectives of why people don't go into shelter, oftentimes it's because of noise, it's ugly, it's overcrowded, and stuff. So what we're showing here is that this is the pitch deck for our capital campaign for the dorm. So I want to point attention to, so right now the one phase of the dignity dorms was done, and that's what you just saw in the news story of the demolition. The chapel is completed, which it's now a beautiful, state-of-the-art space. And now we're starting our phase development on our foyer. And kind of, if you can see the project description here, we want to provide a dignified, so the reason why we're doing it is to provide a dignified, safe and personal shelter for homeless clients engaging in coordinated care. So, and we're really focusing on stabilization. So what you'll notice that some of these spaces match the spaces in the pictures that Renell, your professor, had posted. And so this is not what it looks like yet, but this is how we want it to look. So if you notice, there's a lot more green than you would actually see in reality. So when you guys are coming into the space on your visit, I really kind of want you to keep this vision in mind, that one, the effect that we're looking for is stabilization and restoration through the built environment that centers dignity of the person. Two, as you can see, the community garden is supposed to be a social enterprise space. The 4th floor is just to have a restorative space. The courtyard should be a place where people really feel like, oh, wow, this is a place I want to come into housing. It should feel like, as our CEO has sometimes said, I wanted to feel like Soho House, Skid Row. And the idea is that just because you're unhoused doesn't mean that you don't deserve appropriate housing and a restorative environment. You could kind of see that theoretically this would be the proposed timeline that they would hope to complete all parts of development. Mind you, this is stuff we're still fundraising for if you want to scroll down. And this is what, if you're going back to your funding, part of what we try to do is actually fundraise. So these are different ways that different sponsors can come in at different levels. And this is one way that in the nonprofit sector, when we're trying to augment our funding from like federal contract or, stuff, oftentimes private fundraising and helps us get the unrestricted funds. Because for instance, and going back to what you guys are studying in this course, you may get funding for, say, the building, but they may not fund vegetation or the maintenance, or vice versa. So oftentimes we may be working with partners or private donors to help meet the gap. But that is pretty much, that's the biggest kind of high level overview I could get within our time. And I want to give you guys time, space for questions, thoughts, comments. Yeah.
And as you're thinking through the questions, one of the components that you all are to, be able to identify is stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit more about who and what is a stakeholder, but just to put it out there, everybody's a stakeholder, right? Every resident, every community-based organization, and so on and so forth. So throughout this course, we've talked to several different stakeholders, right? Through our field trips we've already gone on, the field trips we will go on, as well as the guest speakers we've had. So Monique is here as a stakeholder, and this is a great opportunity to ask any questions to help, understand the different needs based off of a contested site intervention, right? And so definitely take advantage of this opportunity.
You
All
can
right,
ask
Steven.
anything, y'all can ask anything you want. Don't be shy. We need we need the hard questions and the brave questions, especially in design in this space. So I want to encourage your radical honesty and brave choices. This is your space to learn.
All right, jump in there, Steven.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
I had a question about accessibility, right? When you're designing and you're programming, right, these systems, right? These homeless people that come in, what is like the eligibility, or just what is like that whole process? It's like, does it get to a point where it gets too full? I've seen videos of homeless people not wanting to go in shelters because they wouldn't let them smoke, and all that sort of stuff. That how do you design with that is my question.
So I'm going to use the words of my CEO from our most previous presentation on this. We have to recognize the difference between what is a rule and what is a right. So oftentimes you have to consider the fact that the first thing that you want to keep in mind as you're going through your design process, particularly with dealing with homelessness, is the role of trauma in space. Most people experiencing homelessness have a lot of trauma around institutionalization because, one, they may be justice involved, hospitalizations, a history of racism where they are incarcerated at higher levels than, say, someone who is white or white presenting. And so you have to keep in mind those socio-political politics of space. So by and of itself, transitional shelter is not always fancy. Really, a lot of times transitional housing is looking for a density of beds rather than, whereas in permanent supportive housing or other types of transitional housing, which may be, bridge housing, which may be 6 months to a year, they're looking at, you're looking at longer periods of time. So one of the things we keep in mind is that we do have policies and procedures. We're a recovery program. So by going by it's the rules in our program, that we have a zero tolerance policy for alcohol and drugs. Now we will accept someone going through detox. You may be going through medically assisted treatment depending on what program segment you are, but ultimately, people can smoke outside, people cannot vape inside. Smoking is not a right, and they have a right to refuse being in our program. I think it's also understanding that not every program is best for every person, and not every shelter placement is best for every person. The Los Angeles mission in particular, we are not what is known as a low barrier shelter. And that is a very key point of view. A lot of the LASA emergency shelters and Project Room Key were specifically designed what are to be called low barrier, meaning that they're not supposed to do drugs in the room either, but we ask people to do but they don't have to be sober to get housing. So housing first oftentimes is really designed to be low barrier, because the point is to get someone housed and then address the problem. However, what people have found, housing first works very well for people with what we say a high acuity, meaning that they're more vulnerable. Whereas the LA mission tends to have people who are a little bit, we particularly have a screening process and interview process where, we are dealing with people who are kind of ready for that life change, especially in our longer term residential programs. Now, we used to have guest emergency beds. Now we're kind of shifting to a stabilization model where the beds that you saw in that dorm are intended to be 30 to 60 days. And the whole point is to stabilize the person, assess them, and get them into the right housing. Because what happens is that if you rush through it, you get someone who has, 6 months on the streets, you will go feral. Anybody. By the time you're about 6 weeks in, trauma sets in. At 6 months, you have been completely socialized different. There's changes in your brain. And if you've been unhoused for 16 years, you can develop a lot of different behaviors that can keep you from staying housed. One of the examples that came from one of our community stakeholders that we were on a walk with Renell was that there are people who, when we can give them we hand them keys to an apartment, but then they will start hoarding. When I worked on Project Room Key, we actually had people, even though we gave them a key to their own room, they were hoarding and setting up tents just as if they were still out on the streets and exhibiting the same behavior, because there was either A, not a transition period, B, the housing was not paired with the appropriate services. One of the bigger failures, and this is more my personal opinion with Project, is that they were not required to have, did not provide case managers. They relied on the referring service provider to provide that. And so you had a lot of people who were maybe incontinent and really needed to be in hospice that were left alone in hotel rooms, and we called that a successful housing. Does that answer part of your question?
Yes, yes. I think that gives like a base guideline, like an introduction on, breaking down on, what is right and what is what was the other part? What is a
What
right
is a
and
rule and what is a right?
yeah, exactly.
It is a right if you're a disabled person to under ADA to be protected. It is to have accessibility. It is, but some programs may not be the most appropriate placement for you. It's not, if it's a reasonable accommodation. And they will put that caveat, it is a right to have a service animal. It is not a right to have your pet in a shelter. Big difference.
Any other questions coming up for anyone?
Yeah, so I was curious about one of the mayoral candidates, specifically Rick Caruso, because I keep seeing videos come up that he wants to provide 30,000 rooms for or be able to house 30,000 homeless people in Los Angeles. And I'm just curious how that ties into you guys, or if that's just like a technique for him, to try to one up his rival Karen Bass. And how does the mayor of LA and what are the missions behind these programs and like what they're actually trying to do?
So one, you got to always look at the fine print of their plans. They can tell you, and if you actually go to our Instagram, I actually have both of their talking points on affordable housing and stuff are actually in our link in bio if you want to see Caruso's stuff. And I really encourage you guys to spend some time on our Instagram because you'll learn a lot about the culture of our shelter and our place. But to answer your question in short, the question is, at the end of the day, nobody can just build housing. If I had $2 billion and I said I wanted to build 30 units affordable housing, I'd still need to find a place. I'd still need to get permits. I'd still need to zone it. I'd still need to find a service provider to staff it. So we can't look at every plan that someone proposes as what is going to be done, because ultimately it still relies on an ecosystem to make it happen. And the example I'll use is mental health. Right now, there's a big deal with, we don't have enough, we can legislate all we want to say we need 20,000, we need more therapists, but do we have the money to pay those therapists? Do we have the programs to hire those therapists? Do we have enough therapists currently serving who want to make that money to do that? So to go to your question, I think first one, really look at how people are outlining their plans and what's their implementation plan to do it. Look at the ecosystem, because if, I would say, Donald Trump was a great example of someone who's similar to Caruso in that he was someone coming from the private sector saying, I'm going to take a business sector approach to a public sector problem. But as you can see from Trump's examples, even with that resource and that support, it's still met up to the general limit of that space. And there's nothing that can be done in homelessness that isn't going to significantly involve zoning laws. It's not going to involve the Department of Health. I mean, we wanted to stay, if we wanted to stay open during COVID, we couldn't, because Department of Health Services says, no, you can't. If we wanted to open our floors, we needed to get approved and permitted that it was okay for habitation before we can even let a person live in there. So from all of those perspectives, I think that, you know, when you're looking at, because that is actually an important thing to consider, because you have to consider who is we're right in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. So the future mayor of Los Angeles will have a significant impact on what we can do. They may be like, hey, you know, we really like your organization, we can allocate funding. And I don't think that you can, we want to, you know, going back to that people versus process, we have to understand that you're dealing with people. You can argue with a person, but not a piece of paper. And if we learned anything from what we saw in just the LA City Council, we can have official process, but people still have relationships. People still have biases. People still have alliances. And so you never know really what is acting at what time. So you have to consider all aspects of the system. And, you know, because the LA Mission could say, hey, we want to develop, you know, we want to buy our 3 neighbors and build like a 4-block complex. But if we don't have the right RFP, the right relationship, the right know-how, you know, that bid for that space could go to someone else that the city or someone else feels is more qualified. And so even if you know, Caruso can have the best laid plans for 30,000 hours, but he's still going to reach the limit of process, place, and person, the 3 Ps.
That was so insightful.
Awesome. Thank you, Monique.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Let's have somebody else ask a question. Again, remember, this is an opportunity to get insight from a stakeholder who has a lived experience, expertise as a practitioner, and as Monique's bio indicated, a lot of lived experience from their life experience, right? Growing up, community, etc. So definitely take advantage of this opportunity and think about your finals that are coming up, right? You need some context for that. So yeah.
Yeah, you can ask me any personal question you want. I'm an open book.
Going once.
Maybe like one so far one question. Maybe it's a little bit about zoning, like especially when building like these kind of establishments. Is there some kind of like some zoning requirements or like restrictions in which you can like put these kind of places? Because, or like, I don't know how to say it, but like, yeah, is there like kind of like just some zoning regulations do they still need to follow when building like these kind of establishments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, where every place has zoning requirements. And so
Yeah.
like community, this is like the people that you see that are like NIMBY, not in my backyard. Oftentimes they are refusing an affordable housing shelter in their neighborhood because they feel like it will bring down their property values. Or people will try to hit zoning law to be like, oh, well, you know, your design is 8 feet above what is proposed. You know, so yes, it does. Also, you know, it's going to depend on the amount of people. You know, obviously, if we were providing medical services, you have to be zoned in a place that has commercial zoning, and there may be special exemptions based on the place. Now, with the LA Mission in particular, and to bring it kind of to the assignment that you're going to be doing, we would have zoning restrictions. For instance, like, you know, it may not be feasible for us to have a working farm. You know, I mean, we could have like a hydroponic roof towers, but you know, zoning requirements may make it so that we can't raise chickens up there. So that would be an example of a zoning law that would affect a structural design, you know. You know, we're private property and we own our property, so we can place as many trees and stuff as we want, in so long as that, you know, we're in zoning requirements, you know, we're not putting up, You know, we're not messing up with egress and like access to space for people who may be handicapped. You know, like we couldn't take out our handicap ramp to put up a tree. That would be an example of like how zoning and or permitting processes could ding that. But I think that if it comes to the greening of our space, I say go nuts. We really want to see a like we would love to see you're feasible and you're crazy. Because you're, you know, just to let you guys know, we have some opportunities actually to implement some of the ideas that you present. So no pressure, no pressure. But when I told our leadership that you guys were doing this project, they were super excited because there's a couple of potential opportunities for greening spaces in Skid Row that we may be able to apply to. And so your designs and your rationale and your assignments may actually see some action in Skid Row if it's actionable. And I put that out there because, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a student, you know, honestly, like as a person with lived experience, and lived experience is a big word that gets around, but you know, like I don't want to see homeless people living in places that I wouldn't want to be in. If I don't want to put my head there, why would I want to send someone who went through something like me there? You know? And that's really the, like, if there's one thing that you could leave with from this conversation, it's design the way that you would want to see it designed. Absolutely. But design as if you were designing for yourself and you had to live there and you had to spend time there. And this was a place that you were going to heal from pain. This is where you're going to heal from trauma. You know, how would you build healing into an environment and a place where they're already not wanted? You're designing for a population that is, one, not seen, two, that is unwanted in a lot of spaces, three, that is seen as unrecoverable, and four, seen as not deserving of anything beyond the basics. And that if they ask for dignity, then they're asking too much. And you really, like, you got to really get into the psychology of that part of design to really get the task that you're being asked to do with the space. Because what we're asking you to do is actually something bigger. How do you build hope into an environment? How do you build motivation into an environment? How does the tree that you put it, like, you know, is it just a tree, or is it going to be a wishing well tree? You know, is it a tree, or is it a tree to memorialize the deaths of Skid Row? You know, whatever that is, those are ways that you can play, and your design thinking can really have a psychological and real-time impact.
That's a powerful, powerful statement, especially in relation to how to use natural green space to memorialize a lived experience of a space, right? And we all talk about site narrative and the history of site. So I really appreciate what you uplifted there, Monique. We'll make room for one more question before we let Monique go. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Monique. But I definitely want to make space for a student to, one of the students to ask one more question. I kind of want to go to you, Edgar, but I do want to make room to see if anyone else who hasn't spoken already wants to uplift first. Do any of our lady students want to speak up and represent? I don't think we've heard from any of you this evening.
Actually, I did have a question earlier about the women's, or just like women's experiencing homelessness. I know there's like a really big problem of like sexual assault. And like, I just was wondering how you guys handle that, because I know that a lot of people who are unhoused go through assault, but I know also that like a lot of the times it goes kind of unchecked, and that's a big reason why people don't want to go into like shelters, these group shelters. So I just wanted to touch on that.
So the LA mission deals with it in that we have sex segregated wings. So women stay on one side, men are on another. Mixing in a program element tends to happen more or less, you know, during like religious service or maybe during, you know, certain classes. But outside of that, women, we have kind of more of a sheltered model. Also women, I mean, now this will reflect, I wouldn't say this would be standard, but, you know, we have, I think as an organization, we tend to have a more traditional view of gender. So in some ways, you'll see in the culture of the organization, women are more likely to be escorted around the community. You know, like a woman, like a male student may be able to go out by themselves, like down the street to their work, but a female student is more likely to be escorted by another student, or they're going to be escorted. So we handle space in that we keep, like, we can't really do much to alleviate sexual assault that happens in encampments on the streets outside of providing those DV services and emotional support services. I mean, we're open to anyone out on the street who needs anything. But that also relies on the person actually being able to identify their need and needing and wanting the help. Because I mean, we do outreach all the time. So we have a once a month prayer walk where we are like going out on the streets and we visit encampments and we will hand out lunches and we check in on people. So one, we have a visible footprint in the community to make sure that we're going out there and we're not just making people come to our door. We're considering expansive outreach where we're trying to put people in more non-traditional places. So again, to remove, how do we meet people where they're at and remove the barrier of having to come in our door? Because psychologically, going in through a gate to go have an appointment with a person can be very different than seeing someone at your local supermarket or the park or the barbershop. And to that point with women, you know, we have a zero tolerance policy for violence in our particular shelter. You may not see that at other shelters though, because where the first goal is to keep people housed versus like that, you're going to see possibly a higher tolerance for certain types of behaviors. I can tell you from my experience in Project Room Key, I saw many circumstances of clients getting sexually assaulted and their alleged perpetrator still being housed in the same place because it could not be substantiated. That is a very terrible thing that I wish was not the case, but at least within our shelter, we have a zero tolerance policy for violence and or assault. We're really adamant that, you know, women in particular are not left alone or unattended. I mean, and that's not to say that we're creating an environment where people have no privacy. That's not it at all. But it's just like, it's more, you know, it's more common sense to have a person, you know, a woman alone is a more vulnerable target than a woman with a staff member, you know, especially in a place like Skid Row where there is a higher incidence of assault on women in particular.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree. I actually have a follow-up question to that, and I
Sure.
appreciate you answering my question.
Absolutely.
As far as like LGBTQ like youth or just individuals in general, like if we were speaking in terms of like trans people, do you have any experience? Just like, I'm just curious, how do you guys deal with that situation?
So right now, I think that's an interesting, because this is actually an area where we are changing and this is a culture shift. So as I said, we are a faith-based organization, and for historically, the organization has held more Christian traditional views of it. However, when it comes to trans person, as of right now, if a trans person were to come into our shelter, they're allowed to be housed, but they would be housed in the gender that they are assigned at birth unless they went through gender reassignment surgery. One of the reasons was also one, security, just because people who are trans do have different needs just in terms of like what they need in terms of therapy, medication access that may be incompatible with parts of the program. That being said, we are actually looking to try to build a specific trans shelter for people who are trans identified. That is something, so we are as an organization supportive of that, you know, but it's kind of goes back to what we're saying about not all housing is the right housing. You know, putting a transgender female with people who may be hostile to that does not do anything good for their well-being. It's actually a safety issue in Skid Row. There's actually right now, I think, only one trans housing, and I want to say it's called, I forget the name of it right now, but there's only one housing option within Skid Row that specifically meets the needs of people who are transgender. But like if someone was gender fluid or something, I mean, I think that this is an evolving point of view, but with previously what the policy was that, like, especially in the women's shelter, like, even though someone may be a trans woman, if they went through gender reassignment surgery, they could and were legally changed over, they could absolutely be housed at the shelter. There's no prejudice to the fact that they are trans. It is just, for some people, it's been a sensitivity issue around gender, specifically more around people who've experienced domestic violence and stuff. And not to say that it's not based in a negative assumption of people who are trans that are more likely to be violent. It's just, for some people, it may evoke a trauma response knowing that. So, and also as well as being mindful that that it is a population that has, unfortunately, due to people, gay men, absolutely, gay men can absolutely be, we've had gay men, we've had lesbian women. We have a strict relationship policy, so people are not supposed to be in romantic relationships with either each other of any gender. So that is an equal policy across the board. But I think the thing too is that that comes out in the interview process. It's not, we're kind of really upfront about this. If you're coming into the residential program, it does have a Christian lens, meaning that it tends to have a Christian view relationship. It is your choice if you want to deal with that or not, though that's not the focus of that part of program residency. And certainly under Brit, I mean, there's other programs that don't necessarily deal with the Christian rehabilitation focus, but it's also a matter of culture fit. I mean, if you are like I would put it like this: if you're like pro, and I don't mean pro sex worker, but if you're like, if you're kind of like, yeah, living my best whole life, kind of,
Sex positivity.
Yes, thank you,
You're
thank you.
sex positive.
If you are very sex positive, believe in polyamory as like a right and all of that, maybe a Christian discipleship program may not be the best fit for your worldview. However, it doesn't mean that you're not a person worthy of being helped. And so we would definitely, in those perspectives, like if a person's like, yeah, this doesn't seem like the fit for me, we would absolutely go through whatever we could do to do a warm handoff to a partnering agency and refer them, or we would still help them with housing navigation services or outreach services. I mean, a gay we definitely, within outreach services, we have transgender people all the time. I mean, they can come, they may not be able to come, we give them clothes, we may give them food, like, so that has no bearing on the kind of service that they get. But you do, going back to like the first thing I said, you want to consider the population and what is good housing for that population. I mean, I would not want to be, I would not personally, and this reflects my personal opinion, not the opinions of the Los Angeles Mission. I would not want to put a person who considers himself trans in a sex segregated environment that did not encourage fluidity throughout everywhere, because that would possibly put them in a place where they are contesting with something that is very important to themselves and their identity.
Yeah, I totally get it. Yeah, I was just curious. Thank you so much.
Okay.
It
No, I
definitely
appreciate it.
answers my question.
Yeah, those are very, very important questions, and I appreciate you all uplifting those questions. And thank you so much for your thoughtful response to them, Monique. I think one of the things that I've noticed, I worked in homeless supportive service with Hopix, and they actually opened one of the first trans housing for homeless supportive services. So that's really awesome, right? And that's an area of opportunity. And there's also an opportunity to provide housing for men with children, right? So there's a lot of shelters that provide housing for mothers with children, but not often do men with children get placed in housing where they're able to stay with their children. And so there's some big gaps in regards to capacity, in regards to accessing housing, emergency housing especially. And so what sometimes happens is these more at-risk groups sometimes get placed like in different challenging situations. They may get the luck of the draw and get pushed up the list because of the barriers to get emergency housing. But again, those barriers are some of the things that, as we continue to build the future, we need to be mindful of those inclusive components and some of the traditional practice that sometimes unintentionally, right, blocks people from access to services or creates challenging. But one of the things I really appreciate that you uplifted, Monique, is that through the LA mission, there's so many partners within the ecosystem. And so whenever there's a situation where there isn't necessarily the perfect fit for someone who's going through the interview process, there's this opportunity to do a warm handoff to an organization that may be a better fit. And so I think that that ecosystem component, knowing what role certain organizations play in the ecosystem and even certain stakeholders, we've been talking a lot about stakeholders, play within, an intended outcome. Those are really, really key to understand. And sometimes, whatever your intended outcome may not be ideal for the specific partner you thought, but connecting, the dots to another partner who is more aligned with, like, let's say their capacity or their focus or their central values, right, is really critical. So no, I really, really, really appreciate everything you shared today, Monique. And I really appreciate the thoughtful questions that the students asked today. I hope you all receive some really great insight that you can incorporate in your final projects and paper.
Absolutely.
So yeah, any last words before we let you go, Monique?
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm gonna go back to what I was saying about where we're gonna stand different on the periphery and understand it is that homelessness is not a monolith, just like Blackness isn't a monolith, being Hispanic isn't a monolith, how any group is not a monolith. And so you're dealing with an ecosystem that's numbers focused. It's focused on number of people housed, but not quality of housing. And so I really, really, really want to presence that in your mind because that is something that I think matters to the LA mission. We care about quality of life. So we may not have the highest numbers, but we may have the higher numbers of people staying housed because we do things, we look at the person as an individual and not an acuity score on a piece of paper. And by monolith, I mean that there's not just one definition of homelessness, and it's not a one size fits all approach. Where we stand different
averages, remember?
Right. Yes. It's not the law of averages. And so going back to the dignity by design, how do you design more versatility and dignity into an environment? How do you take, I'm encouraging you to take a trauma informed approach to design. Think about trauma, because if we could have no bars, we would have no bars, And I think that you want to keep looking at the fact that as an organization, we're going to look at things holistically. The spiritual and is very much a realm that our organization embraces and in all forms, not just Christian, but just for people to have a spiritual experience of each other. And how can you foster that in the space? And how can they have a more spiritual experience with themselves? And yeah, I appreciate you guys for just taking the time to listen, for being amazing students. And, I'm so excited to see what you guys come up with.
And just to put it out there, I did send an email and this is in the announcement, but we do have an opportunity to do a site visit at the LA Mission on November 11th. And so I'm going to put in the chat right now your emergency contact, because you already kind of did your sign up for the field trips for this semester. I just need your emergency contact for that day. So make sure you all complete that and I'll put it in the chat. But I sent an email regarding that, and then it's also an announcement since last week. But I haven't yet seen folks add their contact information. And it's going to be on the same document for the first field trip, but there's tabs at the bottom, if that makes sense. So there's tabs at the bottom that go for the other field trips. We actually have one this Friday on the 4th to Moonwater Farms. And that's going to be an opportunity for us to see a residential flip of a site for like a farm space. But for LA Mission, we'll be having an opportunity to go there on the 11th. So make sure y'all make that happen. All right. Thank you again, Monique, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
You're welcome.
Yes, please give Monique a round of applause. Shout outs in the chat. Show Monique some love for the amazing presentation, insight, and information provided today. This was like a master class of not only design considerations, but the importance of home supportive services and the role design considerations play in maximizing the impact and outcome of them.
Thank you. So I will sign off. Thank you, everybody. And I will send any information over to Renelle and he'll share that with you. Or Professor,
Yes.
to be known. All right.
You are totally fine, Monique. Thank you so much again for joining us. And I will be reaching out to you for sure.
Thank you.
And I'll make sure the students get those documents.
Absolutely.
Awesome. How was that, y'all? Did y'all enjoy that?
Yes,
Thumbs
that
up. Great, great, great. Awesome. Okay, so, this is the site, right? This is the rendering, this is the model that they have. And it's really cool to kind of see this because this is what we'll be able to visit on that field trip day. This is what it looks like. Some of these areas that you see, this large area here is right here. This area, these two things are the large rooftop area. And then this right here, this awning with the awnings over it, this is on the women's shelter side. And this is the top, like the way that you see it from here. If that makes sense. So it's really cool to kind of see the way that the model represents the actual site. And this is the courtyard. As you can see, there's a lot of concrete. And so as Monique discussed, there's an opportunity to reclaim as much green space as possible in this area. And this is right in front of the site. So when we're thinking about site and a lot of the things that were discussed in the conversation, it really goes back to a lot of what we discussed in our first class, right? The relationship people have with their identity, age, sex, hereditary factors, their lifestyle, community, local economy, activities, built environment, natural global ecosystem, all that influences so many different components, right? And it's this ecosystem that all of these things operate in that influence the people that exist within it. And so when we're thinking about the built environment, everybody is a stakeholder, right? Who are the stakeholders? Everyone is a stakeholder. Government, residents, developers, academic institutions, philanthropic organizations, architect and design firms, as well as the built systemic and natural environment. After, humans do their little thing with tampering with the built environment, it becomes its own character and influences a lot of these outcomes as well, right? Biodiversity, air, streets, routes, living, playing, learning, market, network, work-life balance, right? Climate change, natural habitats, buildings, places, work, shopping, moving, wealth creation, social capital, diet, physical activities. All of these things are influenced by all of these stakeholders. Every single one of us is a part of this, right? There's systems for sure, but at some point we become participants in those systems, and we can either make them more equitable and inclusive or more exclusive and inequitable, right? And that influences the macro economy and politics. It develops the culture and develops global forces, right? the other neighborhoods in other regions, just like this arrow, it goes back and forth. It influences each other. All of these components influences these outcomes, and then these outcomes influences those components. All of these represents the determinants of health and well-being in our neighborhoods and the way we experience them in our day-to-day lives. But again, when we're talking about our role in this conversation we've been having in this course as landscape architects, everyone is a stakeholder that we have to understand how they're impacted by site or how they're impacting site. So with the video we watched at the top of the class, all of the amazing insight we've gotten so far in this course, and the amazing information shared with us by Monique today, we are going to have some class discussion questions, which should be right here, but they're not. So I'm going to pull them from the module. And the module for the course this week is up. But these are your questions. We're going to take some time and respond to these questions here. I'll put them in the chat. Let's see. Boom. And then I'm going to put them on here too, because they should be right here. Boom. Boom. Okay, so the questions that I want you all to answer for our short discussion time is, why is everybody a stakeholder? And I want you to consider everything we discuss in the class, different considerations you need to make of site and the role each stakeholder plays in that. I want you to identify 4 stakeholders that we have learned from in this course. And that means like we've learned directly from, we've engaged with them either on a field trip, they spoke at our class. I want you to identify them, their, role, whether they're, what type of stakeholder group they represent, right? I also want you to think about the readings and which frameworks and prototype processes resonate the most with your midterm project, or at least in general, which ones resonate the most with you? Like which one is like, oh, that's my go-to one. I really like that one from the reading. Because in many of the readings, we definitely identified prototypes and frameworks and processes, but I really want you to look at the prototype book. My favorite one this semester by Yunju, this one. Zhang Yu. Yeah. So which of the prototype processes and frameworks in that book resonate the most with you? And what is the individual's relationship to policy and urban design? And how does it impact the individual, right? And so what is the individual's relationship to it? Do they, and this is from your experience. How have you experienced it? How have you seen other people interact with policy and urban design? Do they engage with it? Are they a part of that process? Whether they're a part of it or not, how does it impact them, right? And so those are the questions I want you all to consider while we break for about 10 minutes. I will be back at 7:45. Respond to these 4 questions, submit them for your class discussions on the module 10, and then we'll get on with the lecture. Any questions before we go ahead and answer and respond to these questions? Nope. All right, cool. I'll play some music. Let's go ahead and get that done real quick, and we'll get back to it. All right, 10 minutes. All right, for the sake of time, we are gonna do a quick 10 minutes today. I'm gonna have y'all wrap up at the 7:45 mark, which just hit. If you haven't finished, feel free to complete it and submit it once it is done, but I am gonna pick on a couple of y'all to share. Linda, if you can share your response to why is everybody a stakeholder?
I wrote down because everyone uses the landscape.
That is a great point. I'm gonna go to the unknown user, who is Joshua. What was your response to that?
Yeah, so just kind of, yeah, and why everybody's a stakeholder. So similar to the previous response, so like people, like it's not just the organizations or people that built the spatial environment that that have the responsibility to maintain it, but yeah, I mean like homeowners or just like even like outside users or like newcomers, because they also have like a role in like respecting the landscape to make sure to you're not purposely like vandalizing the area, like to kind of to have the environment like safe and like safe, secured, and like just like everybody has a role too to kind of like be part of like the urban development and like knowing too like what the city needs or like what these people need to kind of improve some of these conditions.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's a good point because everybody plays a role. I really like that. And we should be able to get insight from each of those stakeholder groups too, within the capacity of, our project to understand, what values they hold and how we can represent that within the site or how that can influence the site and its most optimal outcome getting achieved.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Let's go to the next one. I'm gonna go to you, Hermilo. Who are some stakeholders that we have learned from that you have done that you identified from that response?
Yeah, I wrote down residents, academic institutions, architects, and design firms.
Nice. That's perfect, right? Who are the specific ones that we've heard from though? Like, thank you for writing that in your response, but I want you to dig a little bit deeper and identify some of the folks that have shared their time with us who represent those groups.
I would say the government.
And what's the name of that a group that we've connected with?
I don't know.
I do. I'm gonna push you, Hermilo. I'm gonna push you because you've been present, in these class sessions with our guest speakers. So they represent stakeholders, right? So what type of stakeholders were our guest speakers? Who are the people we've heard from on our field trips, right? Like, do you remember any of the people's names or the organizations they represented and they told us that they represented?
Oh, it's a private organization, I think.
Right, but do you remember any of their names?
No.
Okay, cool. I want you to research that, right? When you submit your response, everyone should be identifying the name, right? These are people that we've connected with. They represent organizations that have names, right? And so I want you all to be mindful of that because these aren't like they represent these stakeholder group generally, like you've spoken on them, Hermilo, right? But what we've been able to do in the class is also identify specific representations of those groups. And those are people that have names and groups that have names, right? And so Stephen put one of them in the chat, Garden Butterfly. So I'm pushing you on that, Hermilo, as I'm hoping that everybody is being pushed as I'm talking to you through this, to be thinking within those groups, the specific, you know, stakeholders we've engaged, their names in their organizations, right? Jenna?
Yeah, I was thinking of the one from Ascot Hills Park, but I really have a terrible memory and I could not remember the organization. It was the one with the trees. I think it was like Northern. I
Northeast
can't.
Trees.
Okay, Northeast Trees.
Yep,
That's what I was
yep.
thinking of.
Northeast Trees, yep. They, Gama, Jose Gama. And I forgot our other friend's name that was with us. Do y'all remember his name? I'm gonna have to look at my email. But those people's, the Northeast Trees is the organization, and then Jose Gama is one of the folks. So yes.
I got a cool one for you guys. This is actually from studio. Our studio is focusing on sea level rise, and we actually met with Boyana Creek and Friends. And you know, that's a stakeholder, that's like a nonprofit organization working with the EPA and just trying to get the better quality of the Bayona Creek, which is another ecological stakeholder. You know, you put two and two together, you start piecing that, you know, what she recently said, you know, not everything's a monolith, you know, so you have to just identify everything, and that also includes you. So just think about that.
That's awesome. I think his name was Jose too. But Gama goes by, his name is Jose, but he goes by Gama, and I think the other dude's name was Jose too. So that's awesome. But no, thank you for sharing the example from another site. That's a great example of stakeholders. And then I really appreciate you uplifting the environment as a stakeholder as well. Anybody else? Let's go to Ryan. I know Stephen put Garden Butterfly in the chat, so I'm gonna go to you, Ryan. Who are some stakeholders that we connected with in this class? Or that you have connected with this semester? And I know that sometimes your audio's out, so feel free to respond in the chat. And then I'm gonna go to Paige. Paige, are you there? Thumbs up. Yes, you can type in the chat. Awesome. Ulysses, I'm gonna go to you for the last question, and then we'll move on as we wait for the responses. Or the next question. Actually, I am interested in these processes. Which one of the processes or frameworks stand out to you in the readings we've gone through?
Okay, for me, I would say, to get like context of like the situations that, you know, are in the readings, I would say it's the hero, villain, victim framework. I think it's just it's like a good way to summarize, I think, like the essential characters or you know, stakeholders that are at play if there's an issue, and sort of like it sort of illustrate that. So I would say that's what I've been trying to use in my midterm. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. And I see Ryan mentioned Brandy from Garden Butterfly, and Paige acknowledged Destination Crenshaw. So those are some great examples. And thank you for sharing, Ulysses. let's go to Edgar for the last question. What is the individual's relationship to policy in urban design, and how does it impact them?
So specifically, we're talking about those private organizations like Northeast Trees and Brandy's company as well, right? That's like
So this
sort of
question, I want you to think of it more so like as a resident, right? So like, how
Mhm.
does a resident experience policy and urban design? Like, what is their relationship to it? Are they a stakeholder? Do they have to engage in the process? And then whether they do that or not, like, how would you say it impacts them?
Mm,
And this could be like how you've experienced it. Like, I know you've been doing freelancing, and so
yeah,
you've engaged in the urban design process, right? But
yeah.
like, is that normal for like the regular person to do? And how, like, how would you say an individual's relationship is to those types of processes?
Right. Gosh, well, specifically with landscape design and residential, my experience has always been basically revolves around money, and how much they can actually spend on a project on like a realistic budget, and coming up with numbers for them depending on plants and the future of their expenditures as far as raising the level, raising the property value and so on. But I mean, I feel like it's almost irrelevant to that question specifically, but I
I
think
think that that's a perfect example, right?
okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
because the individual's relationship to it is like, can you afford it? Especially in
Mhm.
relation to like transitioning their lawn, for example, from being a
Mhm.
lawn to a drought tolerant landscape.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, for
the
sure. And
relationship that I think like you're bringing up is a financial one. Like, can you afford any type of changes?
yeah, absolutely. And honestly, with my experience, I've had a lot more people turn down, a project because of how much it would actually cost to, get exactly what they want. And it's, a low water use, landscape, but, realistically, it's a little bit more expensive than that. But uh, maybe veering away from that, I would also think maybe like, certain applicants being matched with like specific programs, specific like the right program for that specific person. And I think I'm thinking a little bit more in the terms of like Los Angeles, and whether kind of the way gosh, being put on the spot always makes me forget of people's names. I would say I'm already Monique talking about you know who they accept and their program and how are they fitted to the program. Some people have to undergo certain screenings, if they are fitted for it. So it kind of makes me think of that, applicants being matched with certain specific programs.
No, that's a really, really big component. And when we're talking about programs, a lot of times those are like programs developed around rules and policies. We're also talking about infrastructure and systems that are influenced and impacted by policy, right? And so the individual has an opportunity to engage in those processes, either from what you were speaking on, I feel like as a property owner and or a resident who's trying to modify, their yard. But then when you're talking about public infrastructure, sometimes, folks may ask their elected official to take up an initiative to address like greening up a concrete infested community, to address potholes, to build in a sidewalk, right? Build in a bike lane, whatever those different components are. Sometimes that's an opportunity for folks to engage in those systems through the legislative process. For example, Whether or not they do that, right, as a resident, you're impacted by the existence of or the lack of that type of infrastructure. And so those are the components that, you know, you want to think about when you're introducing something to a site. We learned in the site reading strategy to look at a site as a part of an ecosystem. And so when we're looking at these design interventions, we want to look at what is being introduced and how will it impact the individual's relationship to policy and urban design. And then also, is there policy and urban design components that are already influencing that site? What are the existing components that are on that site that you're either trying to enhance, subtract, right, from that site? And so that's going to be a really big component to consider in relation to your projects. So let's get back to the lecture. We've been learning about the theories of change in this course, right? And the theories of change center equity in the processes such as land and nature stewardship, building, tools and technology, education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finance and economics, as well as land tenure, community governance, all to advance social change. And so the theories of change really have a process. And in this course, it was really about getting you to the point where you can prototype all of these equity considerations into a design process, right? And so the theories of change is a process in itself, and it follows a program design, outcomes and mapping. It develops key performance indicators, a baseline data collection, implementation and monitoring, as well as data collection throughout that implementation process, as well as an analysis / scorecard, because you always want to evaluate the impact and be able to, you know, make any changes that that analysis indicates need to be made, again, to optimize the intended outcomes. So when we're thinking of the theories of change that guide what you all are learning, there's 3 theories of change. One of them is collective impact. And collective impact brings people together in a structured way to achieve social change, to collectively analyze a problem, to develop a common agenda, and to create a shared vision for a solution. And so what does collective impact consist of? It consists of a backbone coordinating organization or entity. And I feel that in this context that we're using it, you all are the backbone entity, being the landscape architect. And so you're developing a common agenda for change within the built environment. You're developing a shared measure for data and results within the engagement of your stakeholders that you're convening. You're developing mutually reinforcing activities through that built environment space. And you're open and continuous with communication with those stakeholders that you've convened. So again, collective impact is one of the theories of change that should be informing your design approach. Another theory of change that we've learned about is permaculture design, right? And there's several principles of permaculture design, but they're centered around these 3 ethics: people care, earth care, fair share, right? So when we're talking about people care, fair share, earth care, that is really the principles that centered around permaculture design. Any design process should have an outcome that is centered around people care, earth care, which is sensitive to the environment, as well as a fair share, equity, right? Equity as an outcome. So this picture to the left really gives a depiction of a permaculture design principle. It's a permaculture design tree. It's ideally lessons learned, fall like leaves to fertilize the soil, right? All of these components build in to this permaculture design cycle. Energy is collected from those leaves that fall, patterns and awareness, ecological literacy, systems. Your permaculture design process should be holistic. It should be fundamental with assumptions centered around facts and data. And you should develop those definitions. And again, the definitions you're developing should be centered around, you know, considerations of policy constraints, design constraints, site constraints, environmental constraints, and be mindful of different patterns, strategies, and techniques that you want to develop, again, to achieve the outcome of people care, earth care, and fair share. The last theory of change that should inform your design is narrative strategy, right? And so storytelling is one of the big components of getting qualitative data. You have your raw data, which is the how much, how many, but you also want to have a qualitative data, which is how does it feel, when did it happen, why did it happen, right? And you really want to connect with the folks that it's happening to, or who are facilitating certain activities. And really it's around folks who are receiving services and folks who are delivering services. That's really, you know, how I would like break down the different stakeholder groups within the context of a project. Who is end user and who is facilitating the experiences of the end user, right? And so with narrative strategy, it places storytelling at the center of social change by linking movements, building with the analysis of narrative power. Narrative strategy creates qualitative data, which provides a lens to the quantitative data that it leaves out, right? So quantitative data tells you a lot of numbers. It tells you where something may be happening, who it's happening to, but it really doesn't give those people an opportunity to tell their story. And so when you do the narrative strategy, that is you engaging with those stakeholder groups to have a better understanding of what their interests are, what their needs are, and how that will then inform considerations, right? And so with public narrative, it's a way to translate values into the motivation for action. So if you're working with stakeholders who are developers, or you need community to take action and support an initiative, you really want to make sure your public narrative as, you know, let's say a landscape architect, is reflective of those stakeholders' needs, their values, to again, motivate them to take action. It's one of a triad of leadership skills and engaging. You have the heart, which is really pushing the narrative component, really getting people to resonate with lived experience that they may have had or know someone who's experienced. Your strategy should allow you to align different stakeholder interests, values, and then see the different patterns that exist in narrative. And then you take the heart of narrative, the strategy of your head, and use that to develop your action, right? And so I want to take time and play this quick video that is going to be one of the videos you'll read more about or listen to more. Dr. Robert Livingston, I actually had a chance to learn from him when I got certified in workplace equity from Harvard University. And he has a really awesome book called The Conversation. And this video clip goes into detail about the importance of this amazing work and how you all will be using it is to better understand how to navigate some of these complex conversations around addressing equity in the built environment.
The effects of systemic racism permeate nearly every facet of American life, from housing and healthcare to criminal justice and education. In 2019, the median household wealth for white families was $188,200. For Black families, it was $24,100, according to the Brookings Institution. Black people made up about 13% of the US population and 32% of the incarcerated population in state and federal prisons. Only 4 companies in the Fortune 500 have a Black CEO, according to Fortune magazine. Yet, despite these and countless other statistics illustrating the issue, a large segment of the white population still doubts or rejects the notion that racial discrimination against Black people is widespread. According to a study by Michael Norton at Harvard University and Professor Samuel Summers of Tufts University, white people perceived a reduction in discrimination against Black people going back to the 1950s and an increase in discrimination against white people. What explains this disconnect? And how do activists, policymakers, leaders, and concerned citizens move the needle on this intractable problem? These questions are at the center of The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations, a new book by Robert Livingston, lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. On this episode of Behind the Book, we'll look at how Dr. Livingston uses the latest research in psychology and behavioral science to explain the origins of systemic racism, how it affects us all, and what we can do to confront it. As indicated by the book's title, The Conversation is intended to spur discussion about the problem of systemic racism and possible solutions. The discussion itself is an important part of this process. As Dr. Livingston notes in the introduction, conversation is one of the most powerful ways to build knowledge, awareness, and empathy, and ultimately to effect change. Conversation is also a primal way for people to form bonds, build trust, and create community. Dr. Livingston cites a study published in 1952 by German-American psychologist Kurt Lewin. In the 1940s and 50s, the United States experienced shortages of standard cuts of meat, but Americans weren't in the habit of eating the lungs, throat glands, and other kinds of organ meat, despite the wider availability and nutrition that such cuts offered. Lewin's experiment involved two groups of Red Cross volunteers. One group was given information about the nutritional benefits of eating organ meat. A second group was given the same information, but was also given the opportunity to discuss what they had learned with other participants. The end results were striking. Only 3% of subjects in the first group began serving organ meat, while 32% of the second group did so. In other words, the very act of conversation inspired people to change their habits in a way that simply knowing the information did not.
I wish we were computers where we could just enter data and say, here's the information, process it. But we're not. There are all these kind of social complications that we have as social animals that can increase the likelihood that we'll listen. And so I think that the formula that's most effective, I found, has been education, conversation, and action, in that order.
Dr. Livingston intends for the conversation to be a tool for those seeking solution to these problems. The book even includes sections called forums, where he suggests discussion topics and questions that readers can use to spark their own conversations.
I noticed there weren't many tools out there among the books on race that have been written. What's missing from everything that's out there is that they don't actually tell you what to do to make profound and sustainable change toward greater racial equity.
In addition to his teaching and research at the Kennedy School, Dr. Livingston advises businesses and organizations on how they can address racial inequity and promote diversity. He brings that wealth of knowledge to readers in The Conversation, using a framework called PRESS, which stands for Problem Awareness, Root Cause Analysis, Empathy, Strategies for Addressing the Problem, and Sacrifice. The first section of the book is titled Condition, and it's in these pages that Dr. Livingston explores the first two stages.
The very first section of the book on condition, starts off with this whole question of problem awareness. And I actually present data that shows that not everyone knows there's a problem. And in fact, a big chunk of the white population would say that anti-Black racism or anti-people of color racism is not a real thing. Part of the question then is, if that's the case, then how can we begin to address the problem if there are people who don't even know that there's a problem, or to the extent that there is, the problem is the opposite.
Dr. Livingston dives into the psychology and behavioral science research canon to explain the phenomenon of racism, its origins in the human psyche and history, and why so many people deny the very existence of the problem. He illustrates the myriad ways in which people of color are subject to inequity and oppression, and he discusses how humans seek to construct and maintain social hierarchies. The second section of the book, Concern, discusses how readers can inspire empathy in others so that they are compelled to do something about it. He divides people into three groups, each requiring a different mechanism for feeling empathy. And in his talks, Dr. Livingston uses analogies from the animal kingdom to illustrate these groups. The first are individualists, who aren't concerned about anyone else and simply want to stick their heads in the sand like ostriches.
They just want what's best for them. You know, they don't want someone to be oppressed, and they don't really want someone to not be oppressed. They're indifferent to what happens to other people. Their focus is what happens to me, and they will do what's in their own best interest.
The second group are competitors, who aspire to stay at the top of a stratified system, like sharks.
So unlike the individualist who's indifferent to other people, the competitor is actually focused on other people and keeping them down, because to them, you can't be Mount Everest unless there's a battle.
The third group are pro-socials, and like dolphins, they thrive only when they are a part of a pod of equal individuals.
Who are people who want sort of an equitable distribution and everyone to have. That's the first thing to realize, is that there are stable individual differences in this. I talk about it, and I talk about the different ways to sort of approach those three different types.
For each of these groups, the strategy for getting them invested in the fight for racial justice differs. For individualists, one might need to make a practical case for dealing with racism. In public policy terms, they'll need carrots, such as the numerous studies that show diversity improves performance and outcomes for teams. Competitors may require strong disincentives or sticks to change their behavior. And to reach pro-socials, one would need to appeal to their sense of moral obligation. After establishing concern, Dr. Livingston moves on to the final stages of the PRESS framework, strategies for addressing the problem and sacrifice. This final section of the book, titled Correction, focuses on what readers can do once they have understood the problem and become invested in solving it. Although racial injustice is a vast problem to solve, Dr. Livingston distills corrective action into two camps: what individuals can do and what organizations and leaders can do. For individuals, a key point is that while people cannot control their thoughts, they can control their actions and behavior.
Let's imagine a taxi driver in New York City who has strong bias against Muslims and sees a Muslim person hailing a cab. Well, they have a choice. They can either pull over and say, "Good afternoon, ma'am or sir, where can I take you?" Or they can keep driving because they say, "I don't like Muslims." That's the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is more about the feelings, discrimination is more about the behaviors. So if they say, because of my values, I should treat everyone the same, and they pull over, then that's no discrimination in the presence of prejudice. So despite the fact that they have these negative feelings, they have negative behavior. Well, here's the beauty of that. If they do that enough and they have enough contact with Muslims and they talk about the weather or the kids going to school or brother-in-law's wedding or whatever people talk about in the taxi, that will gradually recondition their attitudes.
Dr. Livingston cites research showing that establishing and vocalizing clear goals is important in trying to hold oneself accountable for changing behavior. He also points to a number of actions that individuals can take, such as engaging in civic activism, supporting businesses that embrace diversity, and mentoring younger colleagues of color who could benefit from professional insights and connections. When it comes to institutions, Dr. Livingston provides several cases of major organizations and companies embarking on diversity and inclusion initiatives with positive results. These include Massachusetts Port Authority, which reformed its process for awarding contracts so that developers were required to incorporate diversity initiatives into the bidding process for projects. Subsequent Massport projects became more inclusive, with Black and women-owned companies having a greater stake in new development in Boston Seaport. He also cites the example of Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California, which embarked on several initiatives to boost the diversity of its computer science program and succeeded.
And I would say those are the most optimistic chapters, because as I was doing the research, I would get more and more energized because there's so much that has been done and so much that we can do, and so many examples that I actually of best practices and things that I had to narrow it down.
The conversation lays out in often stark terms what is at stake in the struggle for racial progress in America. But Dr. Livingston stresses that it's important to maintain a sense of cautious optimism.
I do want to make an important distinction between optimism and naivete. what I say in my book is that racism is a solvable problem. And in many ways, that's not just my opinion, that's a fact. Part of what I'm trying to do with my book is lay out a roadmap for moving us from solvability in theory to actual solve in terms of practice or outcomes. I think it's just a matter of having the right information, the right investment, and the right commitment to move us in that direction.
The book is The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations, written by Dr. Robert Livingston, lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. It's published by Currency. This has been Behind the Book, a production of Library and Knowledge Services at Harvard Kennedy School. Find past and future episodes of Behind the Book by subscribing to Harvard Kennedy School.
Awesome. So I really hope you all enjoyed that video. You all have been assigned a longer video to hear from Dr. Robert Livingston, more about, his book, The Conversation, and get insight about that. But when we're talking about the components that impact racism, the inequity that exists within the systemic environment, the built environment, and the natural environment, we need to identify events. And so in this course, we've talked about some of those events: redlining, freeway sighting, environmental injustice, clearance displacement, seizure, erasure, police violence, war on drugs, deportation, educational segregation, divestment, outsourcing, automation, wage theft, deunionization, retention challenges, as well as health impacts like COVID, right? And so these events oftentimes either influence inequitable outcomes or lay bare inequity. And I think that's definitely what happened with COVID. We noticed when we were really left to fend for ourselves during the pandemic, and folks were heavily dependent on their remote access to housing, their remote access to work, their remote access to education. We noticed that there was infrastructure gaps that caused inequity in the outcomes of access. When we're talking about the digital inclusion, when we're talking about access to green space, when folks have to do everything remote, let's say they worked in an area that had more green space, had more trees, for example, but because folks were moving to more remote working, they were actually put in a situation where if it did not exist in their neighborhood in which they lived in, they didn't have access to it. So that means healthy food access, that means green space. Many folks disproportionately live in heat islands, right? And so a lot of these events that have taken place historically have influenced the current experiences of inequity many people face. So when we're talking about patterns of behavior, this also influences some of the inequity outcomes and represents another challenge that exists within the built systemic and natural environment. And this really is related to our patterns and behaviors around our understanding of equality versus equity. Equality is saying, if I have a pie and there's 15 people here, I'm going to cut that pie 15 ways, and not consider that those folks here, out of the 15 folks, some of those folks have pies at home already. Some of those folks have never had a pie at all, right? And so when we're thinking about equity, we would want to make sure that folks who do not have pies at all, right, are prioritized. Whereas equality is saying, regardless, we're going to split it 15 ways to the people that are here. Then we have patterns of behavior like political decision-making. Really, sometimes electeds make politically driven decisions to influence their campaigns, to, cater to a specific part of their constituent group. Whereas a data-driven decision approach really looks at data objectively and identifies where the greatest need exists. One of the components that is really effective is using geographical information systems to identify the geographical concentration of issues. When we're talking about issues like overcrowded housing, digital inclusion, COVID impact, homelessness, right? Those can be mapped geographically, and those that data can then be used to identify how investments are made towards design, right? Design initiatives or efforts, right? Or let's say how you build a budget to prioritize, you know, the folks that are most impacted, as well as the issues that are most prevalent. Another thing is impacted demographics are only engaged for the sign off of an idea. So a lot of times when we're talking about stakeholder groups, when we have developers coming into a community, oftentimes they have an idea of what they want there already. And it oftentimes doesn't include engaging the existing community. And so the folks who are impacted by any type of development should be engaged in some way. In a partnership versus a sign off. And when we're talking about a partnership, that means that they should be a part of the process from the ideation phase to the end. And it's not saying that they have to play every single role, but they should have a role from ideation to the implementation process, right? They should know through transparency who are the other key stakeholders and what roles they play in which part of the timeline, right? And so these patterns of behavior, again, should be addressed and accounted for within your projects as far as like, okay, are we addressing this from an equity standpoint? Yes, it should be equity. It should be data driven, and it should be inclusive of impacted people as partners. And so when we're talking about the systemic infrastructure, again, the permaculture design principles, I really hate that this picture is as blurry as it is, but you all have a link to the permaculture design principles in your documents that you have received throughout the semester. So make sure you're referencing those key terms from the first weeks of the course for a lot of these keywords and definitions. But in relation to system infrastructure, these are also some challenges that are faced. There is a lack of equity in service delivery. There's a lack of infrastructure investment that is needed to achieve equity, as well as environmental infrastructure, right? The inequity exists within these spaces. There's also a need for justice and investment, access to program and supplier diversity are also a challenge. So when we're talking about equity, one of the things that Dr. Robert Livingston brings up in the example from the projects in Boston is within those development projects, they created qualifications for the contracts and bids that require different focuses on partnering with women-owned, minority-owned companies. And so having some of those quote unquote rules or some of those practices within the context of policy is really important. But with you all, that's going to be a best practice of your process, right? When we're talking about creating a prototype, right? You all are creating a prototyping process that is inclusive of all of these things, and you'll have a framework that you can move forward and account for all of these things just by you running your landscape intervention process. Another thing is hiring, pay equity, and promotion. That's another systemic gap. When we're talking about equity in that, when we look at how long it takes people of color to get promoted versus a white person or a white man, right? We can map those things in relation to data. And what we're doing a lot now is getting companies to collect that type of data so that we can see those patterns and those trends and address those disparities. But a lot of times you see that in relation to women as well. One of the studies that my colleagues are doing, are trying to identify right now is like this indication of childhood poverty. And so one of the biggest indicators of that is in relation to women head of household. We know that there's a pay gap in relation to women being paid 70 cents to the dollar compared to male counterparts. And when we look at women of color, Black women especially, that's even lower. And so when we're looking at women who are head of household, that's a whole household that is getting that amount less, right, than their male counterparts who are head of household. And so when we're talking about pay equity in women head of household, that is a big indication of childhood poverty in relation to the inequity of pay. Another thing is legal legislative compliance requirements. That's another component. We're talking about like policy constraints. Those are components of the system infrastructure that influences your design consideration, as well as infrastructure for impacted residents, input on the budget, right? City's budget, the design budget, all of those things when you're talking about the impacted group. Sometimes there are barriers for the impacted group to participate. So when we're talking about certain systemic infrastructure constraints, you have to be mindful of that. So when you're building out your, in your inclusive process, you're being mindful about, especially if your client is the city or a developer or whoever, you want to be mindful of some of those systemic infrastructural constraints or challenges. The one thing that's really important to consider is like stakeholders as well when we're thinking about patterns of behavior. Another big one is internal and external stakeholders cannot collaborate or share resources. That's, even within organizations, oftentimes departments and offices work in silos. So really doing an intentional landscape analysis, doing power mapping, understand who the key players are, identifying who plays what role, who has what authority is really critical in the internal as well as external space to ensure that you maximize impact and maximize the leveraging of resources. If you have a lot of partners, that means you have more resources that you can tap into to address whatever issue that is at hand. So when we're talking about using collective impact as a theory of change, it's also a great way to maximize capacity and resources. You want to definitely do a process and procedure, but a lot of times there's a context of that there's only one way to do things, right? And so within this course, we've learned many processes and many frameworks. All of them are options to choose from. And then you all have the, I hope, creative authority that you own it to create your own frameworks and processes with a lot of the considerations that you learned in this course. Another thing is staff and constituents feel like their needs are not always being met. So when you're doing your engagement process, you want to, again, make sure that you're engaging with the people who are implementing the service delivery, okay? That's a big part. So root cause. So a lot of times we are dealing with things, seeing things, and experiencing things as the symptoms of the problem. But if you dig deeper, you find the root cause of the problem. So with the root cause analysis, some of the things that I've concluded in my research, and I hope that you all have learned in this class, is that many times we experience institutions working to make people fit systems versus making systems that fit people. And so with your design interventions, you're really looking at how you're going to create systems that fit people. So be mindful of that because we're addressing the root cause with that approach. Another thing is that investments are made that facilitate inequity in policy and urban design, negatively harming impacted communities. And when you have investments being made into inequity, which I feel is the traditional practice of a lot of our policy and urban design, processes, you are adding to the problem. Like the outcome that we're experiencing of inequity is what I would say the way the systems were intentionally made, especially because investments are continuously feeding the systems that are, achieving inequity as an outcome. So again, when we're looking at the types of investments, where those investments are being made, we have to identify that evaluation and measuring what is it actually achieving and how we're accounting for it. And so we've been looking at a lot of frameworks that I've developed, and we've learned about things in the books. When we're talking about policy and development structure, you definitely want to engage the impacted demographics. Again, really understand how their lived experiences connect to these policy windows that influence their lived day-to-day lives. Sometimes they don't see that connection, but you really want to introduce them to that, especially if your like policy initiative is relevant to them. And you want to leverage their insight to move it towards an implementation proposal and eventually full implementation. When we're talking about impacted demographics, we talked to Monique today, and when we went through a walkthrough in Skid Row, I had a chance to meet Window, and on our field trip, you may get a chance to meet Window as well. And Window works in Skid Row in collaboration with agencies to provide access to resources, support navigating systems of care. He also, he believes like parks should be staffed and remain open at night to provide safe shelters, especially for women experiencing homelessness. And this goes back to what you were bringing up, Jenna, in relation to like, what are mechanisms within Skid Row that are focused on like the safety of women to prevent, you know, sexual violence and assault. And that was something that was brought up in the conversation I had with Window, and he was mentioning that the park gets closed at night, and he thought that it would be great if the park was open at night to provide that safe space only for women, where they can, you know, be there, sleep there, and know that they won't have to worry about anything. Wendell also expressed the importance of meeting people where they are at. Monique talked a little bit about this, but like folks go into a different state of mind when they are in a homeless experience, right? Especially after being there in a long period of time. Wendell said after 3 to 6 months of being unhoused, there is a mental adaptation to the environment that happens, and it's challenging to come out of that mental state. And so you need someone who has a lived experience of that to help someone who needs to transition. And then also, with that being said, many folks who are living in these spaces still need access to a quality of life when they're living in public spaces, right? And so one of the folks that I met also named was Stephanie. She's a business owner and a Skid Row resident. She lives in this her home, right, that they call the White House. And she provides different resources to the residents on Skid Row, like Pampers and stuff like that. And folks can come and get support. And she's been getting support from different community-based organizations to like really build out her space, which is right on the corner in a public space. And it's really awesome to see right outside of the LA Mission how, you know, people experiencing homelessness are claiming contested spaces through, you know, these tents. Sometimes they'll have, you know, these above ground stages built as well. And it's really providing an, I would say a contested space, like a contested space claiming by these people experiencing homelessness in a way that makes them semi-permanent, right? These semi-permanent structures. And she's a business owner, she provides resources, and she's a resident on Skid Row. So when we're looking at the different ways that we do research, engaging stakeholders is a big one. Again, my goal is for you all to take away that all of your engagement should be community vision centered. And then you want to identify the policy window alignment, because again, policy is what gives you your authority. It could be within the organization you're working for. So aligning whatever design, you know, intervention you're doing to what deliverables your, you know, organization or your employer is speaking to, but making sure that you achieve these sustainability, equity centered approaches and outcomes centered around the theories of change you learned in this course. And your design research strategy should be centered around a lot of the frameworks you were introduced to, right? What are the site and regional design constraints and challenges? And we talked a lot about that today. All of the challenges that come up for those 4 different areas around behavior, around events, around relationships with internal and external partners. So yes, looking at all of those different considerations and then building an understanding of your specific design constraints of site. the policy constraints of site, you know, zoning restrictions. What is your site zoned as? Is it zoned residential, residential agriculture? I got a little tongue twist going on. Is it designated commercial, right? Is it single family dwelling or multi-family dwelling? Like what is it zoned for? What are some of the financial constraints that may want to be considered? If, for example, you're talking about connecting it to the needs of any of the stakeholders we engaged. We have residential stakeholders who are homeowners who have, you know, maybe small budgets to consider, you know, what type of intervention they want to do on their residential site. You have community-based organizations that may be able to apply for grant funding or tie their initiative to, let's say, a city-focused policy window like the Green New Deal that we've looked at, right? And those are financial constraints that you want to be mindful of, but also financial opportunities. So looking at your project to look at those opportunities and constraints around finance, socio-political, environmental, economic challenges. Who are the people impacted by site and how does that relate to their needs? And then how does that all influence what you come up as your proposed design intervention? So there's a roadmap, right? Robert Livingston talked about a roadmap, and I've been doing a lot of road mapping as well. When I was a banker at Wells Fargo, that was a big part of the way we approached our financial solutions and achieving that for our clients. And I always saw that as a powerful way to also achieve community development. So I always modeled this road mapping approach to the way that I achieve equity as an outcome through policy and urban design considerations. So this roadmap, you've seen it before, we've discussed it before, but this is definitely going to be supportive with you trying to identify how you're getting to your design intervention. So you want to leverage that theory of change, narrative-based strategy to identify barriers and opportunities in an existing system, investigate challenges and successes present in the target policy area or design area, right? What are you doing a design intervention of? Is it socio-political, socio-environmental, socio-economic? And how are you going to make that relevant to the site and all of the stakeholders impacted by site? What are the design interventions that you are using to connect the dots between the barriers and opportunity of your site? How are those design interventions informing your stakeholders through your design intervention proposals, different structural changes you identify, different accessibility routes that you want to change, right? And then how are you evaluating that result? You would want to reconnect with the impacted demographic. So some of the things you want to consider, how will you test your site's impact, right? So this goes to connecting with your stakeholder groups, understanding the different site challenges, and how to investigate that through the narrative legislative canvas specific to the things that you want to identify. If your challenge is rain capture or water, if your challenge is drought tolerant species, if your challenge is, you know, economic opportunity of site, right? You want to then map out different solutions, the narrative component of people impacted by that challenge, the different permaculture design principles and values that you want to be represented on the site, the landscape mapping, right? Who is your target demographic you want to benefit? Who are the adversaries? Who are your champions? Your systems, what are the existing systems on site? The different design practices that you feel shouldn't be there? And what are some windows of opportunity that you can introduce for any type of design intervention that you want to introduce on the site? So again, this really was an opportunity again to go through what we've been learning in this course and applying site reading strategies to what will eventually become your final projects. And then today you are getting assigned your final writing assignment, which is really an opportunity for you all to individually show, you know, what you've learned in this course and connect it to your design intervention, and how you will be able to convey your demonstration of learning. So I'm going to pull up your final writing assignment. which is public on your module. So it's 2,500 to 3,000 where writing assignment students will demonstrate the site reading skills that they've acquired in this course. Their writing should reflect their prepared site analysis and identify project precedents relevant to their proposed project location, socioeconomic, and/or environmental intervention. Students will apply the tools, language, and processes learned in this course. Students should incorporate assigned readings and learn theories of change to propose an intervention of traditional, extractive economic, and urban development approaches that prioritize profit by exploiting the individual and the environment. Finally, the students will use what they have learned in this course to inform equity considerations for their projects in this course, as well as professional projects, right? So take what you've learned in this course and take it out into the world, please. Be sure to incorporate the theories of change, narrative-based strategy, collective impact, and permaculture design. Students will also use frameworks and processes like Narrative Canvas to support their writing about identifying stakeholders, facilitating power mapping, aligning stakeholder vision, identifying authority through local, state, federal, or company policy, identifying proxy indicators, and more. Students will apply skill practice on field trips to 2 or more of these sites, right? And so what I would like you all to do is to leverage your final projects using one of these sites. If you do not use one of these sites, you should use the site as some type of central precedent of the actual site that you use for your final project. Your midterm should not be anything related to your final, right? Your midterms are, you know, it's the Spark Note or PowerPoint related to what was asked in your midterm, right? And everyone should be doing that separately. That is an individual project. The midterm is individual and the writing assignment is individual, but the group project is for the precedent, the site analysis, and design concept development. Again, your precedent, site analysis, and design concept development should be on Ascot Hills, Moonwater Farms, or LA Mission, or have a central component where they are, you know, site precedented. You know, there should be some type of component to your project, if not your design intervention site. We do have some, like I mentioned, we have an opportunity to go to Moonwater Farms this Friday from 10 to 12. I'm really excited about that. So folks, sign up for it if you're interested. It's in Compton. The address is on the announcements and it was sent an email. LA Mission, we will have an opportunity to go there on November 11th. That is in Skid Row. It's going to be a great opportunity to connect with Monique and some folks from her team and get an opportunity to see the site outside of the pictures that I provided. I don't think we're going to be able to get inclusive action. Unfortunately, they haven't been as responsive as I would like them to be, but that's okay. I think with Moonwater Farms, LA Mission, and Ascot Hills will be good to go. And we have, you know, those folks on board and those field trips scheduled. When we're looking at this final writing project, there is a rubric here for you to really, you know, understand what's going to be focused on. I am going to be looking for your familiarity with terminology. You've received a lot of key term resources, so definitely leverage those. The depth of narrative strategy reflected in your projects, permaculture design, and collective impact strategies concepts reflected in your project. Relevant site knowledge, site analysis should be at the scale of site. Your concept of intervention should be an area in the site. So again, your site analysis should be at the scale of site. Your concept intervention should be an area in the site. So smaller than your site analysis, if that makes sense. Let me know after this if you have questions about that. Your literature and references, definitely want to make sure you have your citations there. You definitely want to incorporate creative stakeholder representation through narrative and visualization. Definitely add photos into your writing project. You know, you don't have to, like, It's not a presentation like you've been doing for the majority of the class. It's definitely a writing assignment, but you can incorporate photos to convey your ideas. You can incorporate graphs and data if you feel like it's relevant. So definitely do so. It'll be scored out of 0 to 250, just like your project will. So your final and total will be a 500 with your project, and then your final writing paper, which is your separate individual project. This is going to be due, your final project, your final writing assignment is due by the last day of class, December 12th, I believe is the date. So you will have a couple of days after your projects and presentations are done to, you know, finalize your last touches on your project, your final paper. But, you know, we're wrapping it up, y'all. We've gone through a lot, but now it's time to show and prove. And I'm really excited for y'all. I think that you've done so great in the class so far. And I do want to open it up for questions. I know we're a little over time, but I do want to open it up for questions. And then you all, again, should have all of your groups decided for your projects.
So I have a question about where is the best place to get information about zoning. So in specific, I am looking at El Aliso tree site on Commercial Street and the 101. It's just a plot of land. Like, where would I find information for zoning for that?
There's a site called Zemus, I feel like it's called. It's Zemus.
Zimus, Z-I-M-U-S.
Z-I-M-A-S, I believe. Let me see. And it allows you to like look up any, you know, parcel, lots, and it tells you what it's zoned for, what the bearing loads are. Let me see if I could. So that would be the site that I would recommend. Let me see if there's
ZemusLACity.org.
Zemus. Yeah, so if you look up any site on Zemus, like any address, it'll tell you all of the zoning components to it.
Okay.
So that's what I used to use when I was doing all of this zoning fun stuff. And it tells you like even if the building has an earthquake, it tells you like how big the earthquake can be before it fails.
Oh, cool.
Anyone who's looking for a group, I would first recommend seeing. Matter of fact, let me pull that up right now. Boom. We're gonna go to people, and then we're gonna go to final project. Boom, right? And then I'm gonna share my screen so y'all can see this too. Boom, boom. So everybody should be in a group. Group 1 is Jocelyn, Juan, Leon, and Daniel Lopez. Y'all see the groups, group 2, group 3. Everyone should be in a group now. So I believe y'all should be notified by these selections. Like, can y'all describe y'all experience on your end? What happens when you're put in a group? Do you get notified? Does anyone want to share? Like, let's see. Edgar, when I put you in a group, did it notify you?
You know what? It did not. I didn't get any message on Outlook. I didn't get a message on Canvas.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, here are the groups.
Cool. People.
Yeah, do y'all see it? Edgar, you're with Jesus and Vivian, Stephen, Hermelio, and Naui, Jenna, Paige, and Ryan, Karina, Chris, and Ethan, Joshua, Daniel, and Linda, Daniel, Sky, and Ulysses. Ricardo, Giselle, and Catherine, Jocelyn, Juan, and Daniel. There are 8 groups, and there are 3 people in each group.
So yes, I can see them. So if I go to people and then select groups, it shows 8 different groups.
So those are your groups. I see some stuff in the chat. Let me see. So let's see. Boom. Where do we find our teams again? Okay, cool. So boom, I think I got notified. Okay, I don't think I got notified. No one got notified. Unfortunately, that sucks. I did get notified through CPP email. Okay, so Ryan was notified. Well, so Josh, you're with me, and Daniel Lopez smiles. Thanks. And I wasn't notified through my email or anything. Okay, cool. Okay.
Yeah,
You all should be able to email each other. Like if you go to your email, right? And then go here, you should be able to like select the course and then find somebody in the class, right? So just do that and then let me know if you have any issues and I can connect you, but that's the way that I would recommend you doing it. Going to your inbox and then finding your folks through the class. Does that make sense? Through the Canvas inbox? That is how I would recommend finding the emails. Does everyone have those instructions? Thumbs up? Cool, cool, cool. So that should give you access to everyone's contact information and allow you to get in contact with them. And so I am going to depend on each of you to do that with your group folks. And if, for example, by next class, you haven't spoken to anyone in your group, you should let me know because that would be a problem. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I just want to check the post. I'm going to check the post because the rest of the course is really going to be y'all focusing on your final projects and your final writing assignments. And we will be having class engagements and we will be having research assignments, but they will not be additional projects for you to complete. And yeah, that's kind of what's happening right now. I'm still debating on whether or not I want y'all to read that last Soft City book. It just depends on kind of where we're at. But we do have an assigned video for this week, which is more on the conversation with Dr. Robert Livingston. We have another video next week with the Sum of Us, Heather McGee. She has a TED Talk that I will be having y'all listen to. So, and we'll be having some in-class discussions about those, right? But between now and for pretty much the rest of the course, outside of if I assign that reading assignment to you with Soft City, it'll be focused on your final projects.
I have another question about where you keep the recorded lectures and like websites and other resources.
Yeah, so